Think about the last time you knew exactly what you needed to do, but somehow you just didn't do it. That moment when you watched yourself not taking action, almost as if from outside your own body, the strange paralysis that keeps us suspended between knowing and doing. This isn't just about procrastination or laziness. It's about a far more complex psychological phenomenon that silently shapes our lives, relationships, and ultimately, our destinies. Over the next hour, we're going to unravel this invisible force. We'll examine how passivity entangles us, why our minds resist action, and most importantly, how we can break free from this subtle but destructive pattern. I want you to imagine your life as a river. Passivity isn't just standing still on the shore, it's allowing yourself to be carried downstream without direction or purpose. Today, we're going to learn how to grab the oars and navigate intentionally through the currents of life. Passivity is the shadow companion many of us never realize we're walking with. Unlike more obvious obstacles like fear or anger, passivity operates with a peculiar subtlety. It doesn't announce itself with racing heartbeats or flushed cheeks. Instead, it manifests as absence. The absence of decision, the absence of movement, the absence of claimed agency. What makes passivity particularly insidious is that it often wears disguises that seem perfectly reasonable. I'm just being patient. I'm waiting for the right moment. I need more information before I decide. These statements can reflect wisdom in certain contexts, but they can also be the comfortable lies we tell ourselves to avoid the discomfort of action. Consider the psychological concept of learned helplessness, first identified by psychologist Martin Seligman in the 1960s. In his famous experiments, animals exposed to unavoidable negative stimuli eventually stopped trying to escape. Even when the opportunity to escape later became available, they had learned to be helpless. This same mechanism operates in human psychology. When we experience situations where our actions don't seem to create meaningful change, we begin to develop a passive orientation toward life. The child who is never heard learns to stop speaking up. The employee whose ideas are repeatedly dismissed stops offering suggestions. The partner whose bids for connection are ignored eventually stops reaching out. Over time, this passivity becomes our default response, not because we consciously choose it, but because our brains have calculated that action yields no meaningful results. Our passivity becomes a protective mechanism. Can't fail if you don't try, can't be rejected if you don't reach out, can't be disappointed if you expect nothing. But here's where the psychology gets fascinating. Our brains don't just respond to our environments, they create our perceptions of those environments. Passive individuals often fail to notice opportunities for effective action that are genuinely present. A phenomenon psychologists call perceptual filtering causes us to unconsciously screen out information that contradicts our existing beliefs about our helplessness. In essence, passivity becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We believe action is futile, so we notice only evidence that confirms this belief, which strengthens our conviction that passivity is the only rational response. What compounds this problem is that humans are naturally meaning-making creatures. When we find ourselves in patterns of inaction, we don't simply observe this fact. We construct elaborate narratives and identities around it. I'm just not a risk-taker. I'm more of a thinker than a doer. I'm someone who prefers to go with the flow. These identity statements feel true because they match our observed behavior, but they ultimately lock us into continued patterns of passivity. This brings us to a phenomenon I call identity paralysis, the way our self-concept can solidify around passive behaviors, making change feel not just difficult but somehow false or inauthentic. Identity paralysis might be the most powerful force keeping passive people passive. It operates on a simple but profound psychological principle. Humans strive for consistency between their actions and their self-concept. When we've integrated passivity into our identity, taking decisive action creates a form of cognitive dissonance, a psychological discomfort arising from contradictory beliefs or behaviors. This dissonance can feel so uncomfortable that we'd rather remain passive than challenge our established sense of self. Let's examine how this manifests. Perhaps you've thought or said things like, "I'm not really leadership material," or "I've always been indecisive," or even, "I'm just not the kind of person who speaks up." These aren't merely observations about your behavior, they're declarations about your fundamental nature. and once integrated into your self-concept, they become extraordinarily resistant to change. What makes identity paralysis particularly challenging is that it masquerades as self-awareness. It feels like honest self-assessment rather than self-limitation. I'm just being realistic about who I am, we tell ourselves, not recognizing that we're confusing past patterns with future potential. The neuroscience here is compelling. Our brains are constantly predicting what will happen next based on past experience. This predictive processing helps us navigate life efficiently, but it can also lock us into established patterns. When we've repeatedly acted passively in certain situations, our neural pathways have strengthened in ways that make passivity the path of least resistance. But here's the psychological liberator. Neuroplasticity means our brains remain changeable throughout our lives. The person you've been is not inevitably the person you must continue to be. Your identity is not fixed unless you believe it to be. This insight points to the first key breakthrough in overcoming passivity, recognizing that your self-concept is constructed, not discovered. You're not uncovering some fixed, essential nature when you label yourself as passive or indecisive. You are creating and reinforcing these aspects of identity through the stories you tell yourself. Consider how differently you might approach life if instead of saying, "I'm an overthinker," you said, "I've developed a habit of overthinking that I'm now working to change." The first statement implies permanence. The second acknowledges pattern while embracing possibility. This shift from fixed identity to changeable patterns is more than semantic. It's neurologically significant. It activates different brain regions and creates psychological space for growth rather than resignation. And this brings us to another fascinating aspect of identity paralysis, the comfort paradox. While passivity often leads to dissatisfaction, there's a peculiar comfort in remaining within established patterns. Taking action means entering the unknown, risking failure, and potentially challenging your sense of self. The discomfort of passivity is at least a familiar discomfort, and humans generally prefer the discomfort they know to the discomfort they don't. This explains why many people remain passive even when their inaction causes obvious suffering. The known pain of passivity feels safer than the unknown possibilities of action. We become like the proverbial frog in gradually heating water. The incremental nature of our suffering makes it strangely tolerable. Breaking free from identity paralysis requires a profound psychological shift, from seeing yourself as a fixed entity to understanding yourself as an evolving process. This perspective allows you to acknowledge your patterns of passivity without being defined by them. One of the most powerful enablers of passivity is what psychologists sometimes call the someday syndrome, the belief that there will be a perfect future moment when action will somehow be easier, when we'll feel more ready, when circumstances will align perfectly. I'll start exercising when work isn't so busy. I'll have that difficult conversation when the timing is better. I'll pursue my passion project when I have more resources. This thinking creates a psychological trap. By projecting action into an idealized future, we create a perpetual permission slip for present inaction. The fascinating twist? That perfect moment we're waiting for is itself a psychological construct that continues to recede as we approach it. The neuropsychology behind this is revealing. When we imagine ourselves taking action in the future, we activate brain regions associated with visualization, but not necessarily those involved in execution. It's like watching a movie of ourselves doing something rather than actually preparing to do it. This creates a false sense of progress. We feel as though we've moved toward our goals simply by imagining future action. Even more intriguing is what researchers call the optimism bias. When we project into the future, we systematically underestimate the obstacles we'll face and overestimate our future resources, including motivation, energy, and time. We genuinely believe our future self will somehow be fundamentally different from our present self, more disciplined, more courageous, less susceptible to the very psychological factors currently keeping us passive. This is why the someday that would supposedly be perfect for action never actually arrives. When tomorrow becomes today, it arrives with all the limitations and complexities of the present moment that we failed to factor into our idealized future scenario. The illusion of someday also exploits our poor ability to estimate probability over time. If you have a 10% chance of taking a specific action on any given day, and you keep delaying, Basic probability suggests you're increasingly unlikely to ever take that action, but our minds don't naturally calculate this way. We maintain the illusion that all potential futures remain equally possible, regardless of how long we've been passive. Breaking the someday syndrome requires embracing what psychologists call temporal discounting, recognizing that delayed action has genuine costs that compound over time. The freedom you gain from having that difficult conversation doesn't begin until you actually have it. The benefits of that creative project don't manifest until you actually start it. The person you could become through consistent action remains theoretical until you take the first step. This brings us to a counterintuitive truth. The perfect moment for action is rarely the comfortable moment. Growth happens at the edge of our comfort zones, in the space where desire for change meets the discomfort of new behaviour. Waiting for comfort often means waiting forever. We've now arrived at what might be the most fascinating psychological paradox surrounding passivity. Most people believe that motivation precedes action, when psychological research consistently shows that the relationship typically works in the opposite direction. Consider the last time you really didn't feel like exercising, but somehow pushed yourself to do it anyway. By the end of the workout, you likely felt energized, positive, perhaps even eager to exercise again. This isn't coincidental. It's a demonstration of how action generates motivation, not merely the other way around. Neuroscience helps explain this phenomenon. When we take action, especially action that aligns with our deeper values or goals, our brains release neurotransmitters including dopamine that create feelings of satisfaction and accomplishment. These neurochemical rewards then increase our motivation for similar actions in the future. This creates what psychologists call a success spiral. Small actions build positive emotional associations, which increase the likelihood of future action, which builds stronger positive associations, and so on. The initial action, however small, is the catalyst that starts this virtuous cycle. Yet passive individuals are often waiting for motivation to strike like lightning, a sudden, powerful feeling that will finally propel them into action. They don't realize they're waiting for something that predominantly comes as a result of action, not as its precursor. This explains why the common advice to just start somewhere anywhere is psychologically sound. Even minimal progress activates reward centers in the brain that can overcome the initial inertia of passivity. What makes this especially challenging is another psychological principle called the contrast effect. When we've been passive for extended periods, even small actions can feel disproportionately difficult by contrast. Our baseline has become inaction, making action feel more effortful than it objectively is. This is where techniques like the 5-second rule proposed by Mel Robbins become psychologically powerful. By committing to move into action within 5 seconds of having an impulse to do so, we short-circuit the brain's tendency to overthink and generate reasons for inaction. We move before the contrast effect can fully activate, and before our identity-based resistance can mobilize. The neurological explanation for this is that different brain regions activate at different speeds. The limbic system, which processes emotions including fear and resistance, often activates more quickly than the prefrontal cortex, which governs rational decision-making and goal-directed behavior. Quick action techniques work by engaging behavior before our emotional resistance can fully engage. Understanding this action paradox fundamentally changes how we approach passive states. Rather than waiting for sufficient motivation, we recognize that taking action, even imperfect, uncertain action, is precisely what will generate the motivation we've been waiting for. If passivity is fundamentally about relinquishing agency, then its antidote must involve reclaiming that agency through what I call radical responsibility. This isn't about blame or self-criticism, quite the opposite. It's about embracing the empowering truth that while we can't control everything that happens to us, we always maintain choice in how we respond. Radical responsibility begins with a profound psychological shift, moving from an external to an internal locus of control. Those with an external locus perceive their lives as primarily determined by forces outside themselves: luck, circumstances, other people's actions. Those with an internal locus recognize their response to these external factors as the true determining factor in their life outcomes. The psychological research is clear. Individuals with a stronger internal locus of control report higher levels of happiness, achievement, and resilience. This isn't magical thinking. It's recognizing the zone of control that always remains yours regardless of circumstances. What makes responsibility radical is extending it even to situations where we could reasonably claim victimhood or externalize blame. It's saying, regardless of how I got here, what happens next is fundamentally my responsibility. This perspective shifts the fundamental question from why is this happening to me to how am I choosing to respond to what's happening. The first question orients us toward passivity, the second toward agency. Consider how differently these orientations play out in practice. When faced with a job loss, the passive orientation might focus on the unfairness of the situation, the poor management decisions, the economic factors beyond one's control. The radical responsibility orientation acknowledges these realities but quickly pivots to, given this reality, what actions will I take now? How will I use this circumstance for growth? This isn't about denying legitimate external challenges or difficulties. It's about refusing to use them as reasons for continued passivity. It's recognizing that while we don't choose everything that happens to us, we always choose our response, even when that choice is difficult, constrained, or uncomfortable. Psychologically, radical responsibility creates what researchers call an approach orientation, rather than an avoidance orientation. We move toward challenges rather than away from them. We seek solutions rather than escaping problems. This approach orientation is consistently associated with greater psychological well-being and achievement. The liberation in radical responsibility comes from a paradoxical truth. Accepting complete responsibility for your life is actually far less burdensome than the alternative. When you see yourself as subject to external forces, you live in a state of perpetual reactivity and vulnerability. When you embrace your response as the determining factor, you reclaim the power that passivity surrenders. This mindset creates a profound shift in how we experience obstacles. Rather than seeing them as reasons we can't move forward, we begin to see them as the specific conditions under which we need to find a way forward. The question becomes not can I, but how will I? Let's now explore specific strategies for translating these psychological insights into practical action. How do we actually begin moving from passive to active orientation in our daily lives? First, we need to recognize what I call the scale illusion, the mistaken belief that meaningful action must be dramatic or large-scale. This belief keeps many people stuck because they're waiting to take significant action rather than starting with accessible steps. The psychological principle operating here is called chunking, breaking larger objectives into smaller, manageable components. Research consistently shows that progress occurs more reliably through small, consistent actions than through sporadic, dramatic efforts. Consider the difference between someone who attempts a complete life overhaul through massive changes and someone who focuses on a 1% improvement in a specific area daily. The research is clear. The latter approach produces more sustainable change, even though it feels less impressive initially. This is where the concept of minimum viable action becomes powerful. What's the smallest step you could take that would represent movement rather than passivity? Not the ideal step or the complete solution, just the minimum action that breaks the pattern of inaction. If you've been passive about a creative project, the minimum viable action might be opening the document and writing one sentence. If you've been avoiding a conversation, it might be sending a text to schedule it. These actions may seem insignificant, but they serve a crucial psychological function. They disrupt the pattern of passivity. Another practical strategy involves deliberately designing your environment to support action rather than inaction. Behavioral scientists call this choice architecture, structuring your physical and digital spaces to make desired actions easier and undesired passivity more difficult. This might mean placing your workout clothes next to your bed if you've been passive about morning exercise. It might mean using website blockers during certain hours if you've been passive about focused work. It might mean scheduling specific times for difficult tasks rather than leaving them to whenever. These environmental adjustments work because they reduce the activation energy required to begin. They acknowledge that willpower is a limited resource and create conditions where action becomes the path of least resistance. Perhaps the most powerful practical strategy is developing what psychologists call implementation intentions, specific plans for when, where, and how you'll take action. Rather than the vague intention of "I'll work on my project this week," an implementation intention would be, "When I finish dinner on Tuesday, I'll sit at my desk and work on page 3 of my project for 30 minutes. Research shows these specific action plans dramatically increase follow-through because they eliminate the need for in-the-moment decision-making, which is often where passivity creeps in. They create a mental commitment that bypasses the psychological negotiation that typically occurs when it's time to act. Another potent technique is the practice of acting as if. This involves temporarily adopting the behaviours of someone who embodies the active orientation you're working to develop. If you know someone who consistently takes decisive action in areas where you tend toward passivity, ask yourself, what would they do in this situation? And then do that thing. This technique works because behaviour shapes identity as much as identity shapes behaviour. By acting as if you're already a person who takes consistent action, you begin to integrate this active orientation into your self-concept. As we move toward concluding our exploration of passivity, let's address perhaps the most common psychological barrier to overcoming inaction: perfectionism. The relationship between perfectionism and passivity is both intimate and toxic. For many, the fear of imperfect action becomes a justification for no action at all. "If I can't do it perfectly, why do it at all?" becomes the unspoken rationalization for continued passivity. This perfectionism-passivity connection exploits a cognitive distortion psychologists call all-or-nothing thinking, the tendency to see things in binary terms rather than along a spectrum. Perfect action or no action, complete success or total failure. This binary thinking creates a psychological trap where anything short of perfection feels like failure, making passivity seem like the safer choice. What makes this particularly insidious is that perfectionism often masquerades as high standards or excellence. We tell ourselves we're not being passive, we're simply waiting until we can execute flawlessly. This allows us to maintain our self-image as someone who values quality while avoiding the vulnerability of action. The psychological antidote to this perfectionism-passivity cycle is embracing what author Julia Cameron calls the perfect imperfection of action. This mindset recognizes that imperfect action is infinitely more valuable than perfect inaction. It understands that growth occurs through iteration, not initial perfection. Consider the research on expertise development. Studies consistently show that mastery in any domain comes not from waiting until you can perform perfectly, but from engaging in what psychologists call deliberate practice. The willingness to take action, receive feedback, adjust, and take action again. This iterative approach to action aligns with how our brains actually learn and develop. Neurologically, skill development occurs through the strengthening of neural pathways through repeated use, a process that cannot happen through contemplation alone, no matter how thorough. What's particularly liberating about embracing imperfect action is that it fundamentally changes your relationship with failure. Rather than seeing failure as something to be avoided at all costs, which drives passivity, you begin to see it as valuable data, information that helps you adjust your next action. This perspective shift moves you from what psychologists call a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. In a fixed mindset, challenges are threats to your self-image. In a growth mindset, they're opportunities for development. The first orientation breeds passivity. The second fosters action. The practice of embracing imperfect action also builds what psychologists call distress tolerance, the ability to move forward despite uncomfortable feelings. Many passive individuals have low distress tolerance. They avoid action precisely because it involves discomfort, uncertainty, or the possibility of negative outcomes. By taking imperfect action repeatedly, you gradually build your capacity to function effectively even when conditions aren't ideal. This increases your psychological flexibility, the ability to pursue what matters to you even when doing so involves discomfort. As we bring our exploration of passivity to a close, let's return to the river metaphor we began with. Passivity isn't just standing still, it's allowing yourself to be carried by currents you didn't choose toward destinations you may not desire. The psychology of passivity reveals how deeply this pattern can become embedded in our thinking, our identity, and even our neurology. But this same understanding also illuminates the path forward. By recognizing the constructed nature of our passive identity, challenging the illusion of someday, embracing the action paradox, adopting radical responsibility, implementing practical strategies and making peace with imperfection, we can break free from the subtle prison of passivity. This journey from passive to active orientation isn't about constant motion or relentless productivity. It's about reclaiming the authorship of your life, choosing your responses rather than surrendering to circumstances. The truth is, the quality of our lives is determined not by what happens to us, but by what we do with what happens to us. And taking meaningful action despite uncertainty, despite discomfort, despite imperfection, is the essence of an engaged and fulfilling life. So as we conclude, I invite you to identify just one area where passivity has limited you, and commit to one small action. Not tomorrow, not when you feel more ready, but today, right now. Because this moment, imperfect as it may be, is the only one in which action is ever possible. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of the psychology of passivity. Until next time, remember, life happens at the edge of your comfort zone, in the space where desire meets action,